This episode of Untold Stories is sponsored by Paraswap. You'll hear more about them later on in this episode. This is like my favorite thing to do. This is my calling. I feel like I love doing podcasting and being able to reach large amounts of people in an independent way without having someone controlling that medium. And to those of my listeners who are listening, what is up, everyone? I am Charlie Shrem. I'm your host of Untold Stories, where together we get to dive deep with some of crypto's and Bitcoin's most influential leaders, brightest crayons in the box, sharpest tools in the shed, to really understand how this movement came to be, who these people are, what inspires them, what gets them awake and up every day, and how, some of these people have made their net worth. We want to understand, to really understand where we are right now. We're going into 2022. Everyone, I feel like we're in this period of disillusionment where everyone is a little bit nervous or what the next 6 months are going to look like. And then more importantly, how we can take everything that we learn from all the people that we learn it with to understand where we're going in the future, make the best investment decisions, be able to take our family out of, one place and bring them into the next. And to talk about that today, Robert Breedlove, you have an amazing background. Thank you so much for coming on Untold Stories today.
Thanks, Charlie. Glad to be here.
I read something this morning actually that said 11.7% of new homeowners have used Bitcoin to help them with their down payment, have sold or borrowed against their Bitcoin for a down payment on a home. And really, this is kind of why I personally got into Bitcoin, because I feel like being able to create, there's that old verse. It's like, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You teach a man how to fish, he eats for a lifetime. I feel like it kind of all gets back to that.
Yeah. Bitcoin's definitely an inexhaustible teacher, it seems like, on either side of the trade. Like, it's either going to humble you if you try to pull some kind of advanced, sophisticated, leveraged, long strategy or option strategy. You're probably going to underperform Bitcoin if you're one of the 99.9%. Or it could also just teach you about money, right? Just trying to figure out what Bitcoin is. You end up in this rabbit hole that everyone describes. So it's interesting, but I don't like to hear about people using Bitcoin to make down payments on their house, though, because that means they sold Bitcoin. I don't think that's smart.
Borrowed against. I hope
borrowed against. That's okay, I suppose.
In a decentralized way. In most of the time, understanding the trade-offs is always something very important. Talking about decentralization and talking about, you talk about the hardest money possible we have on one end, and then we have so many other projects and coins and tokens and blockchains that really claim to be one thing, but they're not. And a lot of people get wrecked. You saw just the past few weeks, like all these crazy things that happen. But I want to take it a step back. You're a Bitcoin-focused entrepreneur, writer, and philosopher. You were raised in Tennessee, attending Southern Baptist churches. You spent most of your life spiritual yet agnostic. Through explorations down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, like myself and Roger Ver, all these other crazy people, you found yourselves becoming reacquainted with Christianity at the age of 33, and you were inspired by Bitcoin, Austrian economics, and a lot of different teachings. And I've kind of lost my way in religion. I'm kind of wandering around trying to figure out where it all kind of fits in. But how did you how did Bitcoin and Austrian economics kind of bring you back to religion?
Yeah, so I grew up going to church often in Tennessee, as you might imagine. That state is kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt, so we take it pretty seriously down there. That and football. But I don't know, as soon as I could really get into some heavy reading, kind of in my early teenage years, I started reading a lot about astrophysics, a lot of very heavy science intake. And so I became pretty atheistic in my mindset. And I carried that until early adulthood. And when I got into yoga, and which got me into meditation, I kind of got back on the spiritual path. But that's, it's kind of there's no doctrine to that, right? You're just meditating, you're doing
Yeah.
yoga, like you're, saying a few words or setting intentions, but there's no mythology that, I mean, there might be, but the yoga I was doing was just kind of a personal experience. I wasn't um, taking it into the religious domain. So, anyways, fast forward into Bitcoin. I'm still kind of on that spiritual trajectory in life, but through Bitcoin, actually, I discovered the work of Jordan Peterson. So I'd say if you're feeling lost on the religious front, just check out he's got a 12-part lecture series he did years ago called The Psychological Significance of the Bible. You can listen to it on his podcast or on YouTube. And it's effing amazing, frankly. He goes through very slowly the first book, first few lines of the Bible, actually, and then he's describing its significance through a lot of different lenses, through kind of like a clinical psychological lens. He looks at other wisdom traditions and religions and philosophies like Taoism. In the East, there's no difference between religion and philosophy, actually. So that was another kind of bridge for me, that when I was in my spiritual
Oh,
phase, I was reading
interesting.
a lot of Eastern philosophy, like Sun Tzu, The Art of War, Musashi, Book of Five Rings. And Peterson does a great job of tying in all of the core themes and lessons of that way of thinking, tying it back into Christianity. So it's profound. And then I would say the Austrian economics piece is, when you read a book like Human Action. I don't know if you've read that one by Mises. It's incredible, man. I mean, this idea of the primary element of existence being human praxis or human action, right? How we allocate our purpose into the world. There's a very distinct moral dimension to this, an ethical dimension that you can't capture in empirical materialist science. And this is key to differentiating and understanding the economic principles that surround Bitcoin, as distinct from Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics treats human beings like particles, right? Like,
Yes.
we're all Homo economicus. You put me in
Yes,
this
that's the
situation,
biggest
I'm
problem.
going to
It's all
buy this and
math.
do that. But it's not true. It discounts human sovereignty. Whereas Austrian economics is, much more realistic. It's based on axioms like man must act, that we can actually rely upon. So,
Humanity, we want to like quantify everything. So Keynesian
mhm,
economics what became the dominant uh, capitalist system that we have pretty much all over the world. Barring different, even the most communist of countries, realistically, the way their economies and private businesses that they claim are private, which are not really private, like China and Russia,
mhm.
are based on uh, capitalism and things like that. Actually, I'm very excited. I'm going to be going to Scotland, where Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. So I remember
That's
reading
cool.
that, and it's one of my So you have the modern day democracies, but it's kind of really interesting what you're trying to get at here is that economics, or really how we all live our lives, shouldn't just be math. It should be socioeconomics too. It should be
Mhm.
how we all interact and act with each other. And
Yes.
I think that's what I struggled with modern day economics. Like, I struggled with that for so long. And then when Bitcoin was created, it kind of took all of the quantifiable levers that small groups of people can manipulate for their own benefit. Because, those who are closest to the money printer gain from it the most.
Mhm.
Where Satoshi removed all of the levers and said, it's all automatic now. And then so we can focus more on the Austrian principles of modern day societies, and where people are generally happier.
Yeah, that's right. It takes a lot of work to get to the level of understanding about the significance of Bitcoin, but you can kind of sum it up in these little tropes. And one of them, I tweeted this out the other day, but if the rules can be changed, then human beings will fight over the power to change the rules. If the rules cannot be changed, then people will play by the rules. And it really is that simple. I think that is the history, both the history of money and the importance of Bitcoin in a nutshell. Because what do we have across all human histories? Like, people warring against one another to control resources. And whoever wins, like in the most recent contest, we see the United States emerge victorious from World War II. What's the first thing we do? We hold Bretton Woods to write the rules in our own favor,
True.
to give ourselves the exorbitant privilege to peg the dollar to gold, every other currency to our currency, and then we can export inflation ad infinitum. But if you reimagine that world on a Bitcoin standard, it's like there wouldn't have been a Bretton Woods to, the rules would have been fixed outside of the control of humans. So there'd be no rules to write for the military victor. So I really consider Bitcoin, you can't separate this domain of morality and what humans ought to do from the economic domain, because that's what we are doing mostly. We're mostly doing economics all the time, right? That's how we get wealthy. That's how we solve problems. That's how we improve our standard of living. So the question that you can't avoid in that pursuit is, what do you do with the free time and the higher standard of living that you afford yourself and others? How do you spend that time? There's a distinct moral dimension to it. And I think Bitcoin's just so damn important because it gets us away from spending that time trying to take from one another
Yes.
or trying to twist the rules against one another. It's like the rules are just fixed. You have no choice. If there's two wealth acquisition strategies in life, there's making and there's taking. And when taking is removed as an option, it's like, well, I guess if I want to be wealthy, I'm going to go over here and be an entrepreneur and participate in making. And Bitcoin is just like this seems like it could be the final push towards peaceful, productive, fruitful cooperation and away from war and
It's interesting
violence.
that you say that, because if you look at like Glassdoor, working at a crypto company is like infinitely better, especially if it's like a Bitcoin company where there's like a core ethos where everyone is following the same kind of mission as what we're talking about. But even so, in anything with like digital assets or cryptocurrency or NFTs or whatever lingo you want to use, you'll notice that working is infinitely better because it removes all the I hate to use the term nationalism, but like individual ethnocentrism that we have, where we all think we're better than other people. Whereas when you remove all that stuff, and I grew up in a very ethnocentric community that really believed they were better, and I hated that. Like I really, to the core, I could not believe that I'm supposed to be better than another person, or from whatever you want to call it. It just didn't make any sense to me. It removes all that. It's so cool. Listen, you've made this your life work. You're a YouTuber. You're a host of one of the most popular podcasts called What Is Money? And you really, like, this is your thread. Why do you believe that financial literacy is like the best tool for individual people to protect themselves?
It doesn't seem like it would be such a problem if financial literacy were not so suppressed. And I'm not
Why is it
sure.
suppressed? It doesn't make sense to me.
I don't know why. I read this quote from Kiyosaki yesterday, and he said, it's no coincidence that they don't teach us anything about money in school in the same way that it was considered dangerous to educate a slave in the antebellum South. They didn't want slaves to learn because that would give them, a better capacity to be an independent thinker and escape and all these things. So it may sound like a bit hyperbolic to equate central banking to slavery. I wrote a piece titled Masters and Slaves of Money, sort of to this effect. But if you really take an honest look at human history, it's something we've struggled with forever. Like, well, there's always been one group of humans imposing their willpower on another group, right? So there's always been slavery or marginalization of some kind occurring throughout all of human history. I think it's a bit naive and maybe even arrogant to think we've completely rid ourselves of that. I mean, you see it. That's what central banking is, right? There's one group that
It's
can
gotten
basically steal the
worse.
time from others.
It's gotten worse. I mean, that whole idea of being able to, like, your families and your family and family rights and property rights and self-sovereignty in this country, it's not the same as it was growing up. It's not the same as it was. It's definitely eroding. And I don't know if it's a lack of trust in institutions or just a lack of trust in other people that we talk to and things like that.
Well, again, back to the rules. When you inflate the currency supply, you are violating the private property rights of dollar users, dollar holders. So even if this isn't cognitively understood, I think it induces insanity in people. Because like if you can't make sense of the world, like, my inputs were costing X, now they're X times
Yeah.
1.5, but my revenue is flat. Like I haven't done anything different. What's going on? It creates all this inflation, just injecting uncertainty into the rules, into the socioeconomic fabric. And so like, there's no better way to drive people insane than to just keep changing the rules. Because like you can't make sense, you can't establish integrity in the relationship between your agency and the arena you're operating in. So how can you can't be sane. You just lose your mind. So I think this, and I've written on this recently. I wrote 2 pieces on mass psychosis. And this was before the doctor went on Joe Rogan and said he thought we're in a mass formation psychosis.
What can you get into that?
Yeah, we've had mass psychoses like the Salem witch trials at a small scale.
Great
The
example.
larger scale mass psychosis, the largest scale mass psychosis is totalitarianism, where there is a
North
group.
Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, Soviet Russia, Maoist China, Nazi Germany. Like we've had a lot of issues where the people in power, which you could say are the rulers, and we can quantify who are the rulers by who is a net tax receiver versus a net taxpayer. So the taxpayer is the one being extracted from, the tax receiver is the one doing the extracting. That is the two sides of the coin. That's rulers and ruled. When that gets really bad, so we know that inflation is taxation. We know direct taxation is taxation. Also, regulation itself is a form of taxation because you're basically impeding the entrepreneur's ability to go out and solve a problem. Instead of just being able to go out and solve a problem and start a business, they need a
Yeah.
license. They need this. They got to do this form. They have to jump through this hoop. So it's adding all this undue cost to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, the ferry conundrum someone mentioned to me. It's like if you have 2 towns on a river, someone wants to launch a ferry system. What are the red tape that person has to go to in various countries around the world? And if you look, most places you can't even, the ferry, if there was going to be a ferry, it would have been owned by the president's brother.
Right. Exactly.
That's funny.
So in my theory, and it's sort of the historical evidence bears it out, is that the more rapidly you violate property rights, like property rights are how we relate to the world.
Yes.
Right. When you think through money typically, but you're also quantifying your assets in money. When you start to ramp up any of these violations of property, whether it's inflation, direct taxation, or regulation, it clouds people's perception or relationship to the world. And that's how you go crazy. Like, what is the definition of going crazy? It's like you're out of touch with reality. Well, violating property rights puts you out of touch with socioeconomic reality. And so leading up to the Salem witch trials, for instance, they were debasing the currency for decades. Leading up to every event of totalitarianism, there's rapid currency debasement, flagrant property right violation. So I think we know this. We know this from 1215, Magna Carta, life, liberty, property. This is the foundation of Western civilization. When you start to fuck with that, it ruins everything at the individual and collective level.
It's very scary. It's very scary actually, because now that you talk about it, I feel like we are going through this mass hysteria right now because the smartest people that I knew for decades, and when I mean smart, I mean grounded and just an understanding of the large world, and how kind of humanity goes through it, people that are much older than me. I see them now just so convinced over one thing that makes absolutely no sense, but gives them confirmation bias on what they already want to believe, that these people are just so close-minded that, and I'm 32, so maybe you could call me young, but I've never experienced this in my life. I've never experienced not being able to talk to anyone about everything. I know in other countries bringing up certain politics with other people, but I mean, the worst thing you could say is if you're a Yankees fan and then someone likes the Mets, you'd be punching it out. But other than
Right.
that, nothing was ever off limits. It is now. I mean,
Yeah.
even COVID, Donald Trump, everything. It's all been off limits. I think it started even 5 or 6 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, even
Well, I agree with
2009.
you. I've never experienced anything like this in my life either. I'm in your same age range. Um, but again, looking at history, it's happened a lot, a lot, a lot. We always create this us versus them narrative, and then it comes to a head. And typically, one of those groups is dehumanized to the point of justifying their purge, right? This is, Hitler did this very, very infamously. He dehumanized Jewish people for a long time before it
Exactly. Yeah.
came to the climax um,
One of the first rules he did before anything was strip Jewish people of economic rights, and that was
yes,
one of the
property.
first things. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And I would point people. Jeffrey A. Tucker has been writing. He's of the Brownstone Institute. He's an
I love
independent
Jeff
journalist.
Tucker.
Yeah, he's been writing some great pieces on
OG.
this.
He's
He's
a
a
Bitcoin OG. He's been around since I remember. Eric Voorhees and I went to the Free State Conference in New Hampshire in 2013 and sat him down with a Negroni and said, "This is Bitcoin. You need to understand this. This is the future." And there was another big libertarian guy right across the hall, and he's like, "Hey, you need to come over here." Who was it? It wasn't Ron Paul. It was like someone just at like a crazy caliber. But that when people really clicked, it was so beautiful in the early days watching Bitcoin click for people when they had never heard about it before. You don't really
Mhm.
get that anymore because everyone really gets it, unless you're someone who really wants to understand it. And I love getting deep. My whiteboard in my office, I have algorithms. No, sorry, I have different formulas from the white paper out, and I'm explaining to people how an old block would have to a new blockchain would have to maintain and catch up with the current chain and to
Mhm.
overtake crazy stuff. It's a lot of fun. It's beautiful. It's like a new religion.
Yeah, it is, and uh, it's an interesting phenomenon to see happening because we've never had a global consensus like this. It's no matter what, even if I'm whatever, pro-vax, anti-vax, pro-Trump, pro-Biden, whatever your divide, if you're a Bitcoiner, you have
Yes.
this weird commonality, and it cuts across all dimensions of your identity. Um, and it is, yeah, another thing I've learned kind of going down this rabbit hole is that all of our social institutions, all of these useful fictions we construct, they have a religious quality to them. So it's kind of there's another element of ignorance here where we think religion, the common modern viewpoint is that religion is some, antiquated thing that we used to use and now we have these modern institutions, but your modern institutions are religious too. Like we're human
Yeah.
beings. We grow up playing imaginary as kids, and then we become adults and we play serious imaginary. But now our imagined orders are like nation states and human rights and money. So the religious impulse of mankind is like, it's essential to who we are. It's what makes us the dominant species in the world. And Bitcoin is something really interesting because I don't know, it's like a religion born from economic and computer science. There's so much veracity in this social construct we call Bitcoin, which is, it's kind of like money, but it's also kind of like an automated central bank, and it's kind of like a national identity. It's got all this weird mix of
Do you
flavors.
do you think that the way we've looked at the Bible over generations as a guide to life from the minute you're born to the minute you die, it's a a beautiful guide to life. Do you think that the Bitcoin white paper or the Bitcoin canon eventually can kind of be seen, maybe modern, I'm trying to formulate my words, like maybe modern society or modern humanity or our brains needed a newer, religions are founded every couple of generations. So maybe this is like the newest religion. Maybe we redefine the term religion to like moral identity, not moral identity. Like, what you see where I'm kind of getting with this question?
Yeah. So one thing that I learned again from Peterson is that again, we look at the Bible as some static object from a bygone era, but he makes the argument that we're living the biblical corpus right now. Like, again,
Oh
Western
yeah.
civilization, life, liberty, and property, that's all derived from kind of the core teachings in the Bible, right? And the Bible itself, it's not so much a prescriptive moral document. I mean, there are prescriptions in there, but it's a chronicle of mankind's moral development over time. Like if you start in the Old Testament, we're brutish and there's all kinds of weird shit going on, and then you get into the New Testament, it's much more understandable, right? It's love thy neighbor and love God and all this. And the other thing he makes the point is that there's a book called Paradise Lost by I think it's by Friedman. And this was a book written way after the books of the Bible. Like a lot of the books of the Bible are ancient stories, but he makes the point that that book did such a good job articulating these dimensions of evil and whatnot that it's almost become part of the biblical corpus. So it seems like maybe over time we do write these new books or create these new social institutions that get
Ah, that's a good
absorbed
way.
into the Bible. So like, yeah, if you fast forward from here, I don't know, 500 or 1,000 years in the future, maybe Satoshi's white paper is somehow part of the books of the Bible.
Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled programming, but I wanted to tell you guys that if you're using Pancake Swap, Uniswap, DYDX, Sushi Swap, you're doing it wrong. You need to be using Paraswap because Paraswap is a user interface, a decentralized smart contract platform that sits on top of all of these. And when you go to Paraswap or untoldstories.link/Paraswap, because they're refunding your gas, if you go there, then you'll be able to, on top of Ethereum, Binance Smart Chain, and Polygon, look for the best prices for your tokens and swap and do everything in one predefined transaction on chain. Instead of having to do the approval to this token, to that token, to do all these different things, Paraswap does it all for you. It's decentralized. They just released their API version 5 that you can see everything. It's all open source. Very cool stuff. Untoldstories.link/Paraswap. If you're using any of the other decentralized protocols, you're doing it wrong because you need to be using the routing, beautiful Paraswap routing system, and it's fully decentralized too. It's gorgeous. I'll talk to you guys soon. The current Bible as we know it, whether it be the Old Testament or or the New Testament, or there's other forks and things that have been canonized over the years, different religions, you can put the Quran in there too. You can, all types of things. Maybe like humanity needs to recanonize every 100 years the most important kind of moral guidance books that weave together, because the Bible, the Old Testament was canonized as the Old Testament, and what I was learning was there was actually fights over that during that time because it was a small group of rabbinical authority who only said these 5 books are going to be included, but at the time they were thousands. I mean, I've studied them, and then the New Testament came, and there was more, and so it's just humanity and time. We like try to freeze things in time, and it's selfish,
Right.
to do. So that's actually a very interesting kind of thought to go down.
Yeah, you're right. We have to isolate things and put them into, words and stories so we can share them and communicate them and pass them from generation to generation. But something is always lost in translation, right? You can never capture the essence. We can never decomplexify reality into a word. There's something, the map is not the territory, as they say. So maybe we constantly have to redraw that map as reality changes over time.
Religion, when it's first kind of created, and over its first generations, if you look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they're created during times of chaos and anarchy. If you look at even Christianity during the Roman times, and then the Bronze Era and the medieval times, Christianity was the reason that modern day Europe, the family system, the church was very involved in inventing the modern day court system in England, which we use common law now globally. And then religion starts to get corrupted, and then things happen, whatever. But so the point is, right, maybe Bitcoin, not maybe, I think it is, Bitcoin is that next glue that keeps humanity going into that next era.
Yeah, no, your analogy to common law is very apt because English common law is decentralized law,
Yeah.
right? This is, we observe what humans have been dealing with forever, and we abstract the patterns of how we resolve conflict and dispute, and we codify that into common law. And then the law itself changes, it becomes very stable and changes very slowly, right? Sounds like Bitcoin, right? Becomes very stable, changes very slowly, versus what we have largely in the US today, increasingly, is centralized legislated law, right? Where one group can come out by fiat and say, this is the law. We're signing this thing into law. Not without, with total disregard to whatever customary law may have been discovered up until that point. So we've moved from decentralized discovery, legal discovery process, to a centralized legislated law process where it's just one group imposing its will on the others. And that's that's what creates instability, in my estimation.
Yeah.
People like to be free. People don't want to be fucking told what to do. So the more you honor that individual sovereignty, and the less you have one group trying to imprint its willpower on others, the more stable human
Yeah.
civilization is.
And then we talk about private property and self-sovereignty. Those two things, when they, and I'll go back to England as an example, the founding of England, because I'm reading a lot of books about it right now. Before private property, private enterprise was legal, and even during monarchy times there were systems to enforce your own private property. You couldn't leave your own town without carrying your money on your hip, and so private property became such an integral thing. Why I guess that eroded over time, and then now Bitcoin, the basic thing of like, not your keys, not your coins. I almost wish I go back generations and say that, like, to people, all this money and property, it's all eroding. Look at 1971, everyone holding gold, and then all of a sudden the government confiscates all of it. So it's like, that was not that long ago.
Yeah, and again, maybe a good way to think about this is, there's scarce resources in the world. There's less stuff than there is demand for stuff. So we have to resolve that dispute somehow, and we have to resolve it in an ongoing fashion. There's only two ways to do it. You can do it by contract. We can agree to some protocol and like sort it out, have rule of law or recourse to arbitration, or money even, right? Money's kind of like this
Yeah.
social contract. Or we can have conflict. We can fight over the stuff. And cooperation and resolution via contract is much more energy efficient and much more affords us easier wealth creation in the world. So it's like, that's the crux here, is we've created Western civilization based on contract, like strong contract law, right? And respect for individual property rights and all this. But we're now moving away from that. And so,
yeah, it's been eroding.
Very importantly to understand, when you hear like, we printed $10 trillion, the typical person thinks, oh, that's great. We didn't have enough money. We printed more money. Wonderful. The government's going to send me a check. There's a bailout. Government's got my back. What's actually happening, though, is they are violating the property rights of the most economically vulnerable in the world. Anyone that depends on the dollar, right? People that are retired, living paycheck to paycheck, economically vulnerable, etc. They're being stolen from to then fund those who own assets effectively. If you don't see that that's going to destabilize civilization, I don't have any hope for you, because
it's going to destabilize a lot of things, and it's also going to very quickly erode our faith. I mean, the fact that the governments will use debasement of currency, you lose immediate faith. When England started conquering France or the lands around that, one of the reasons that all of people living in the lands of France at the time didn't fear against the English was because the English brought with them money that wasn't debased, because French money was constantly debased. No one knew.
Right.
And brought that common law of property rights. And people like that. People like being able to go back and forth between. And so again, I'm like very generalizing everything, but at the end of the day, I think we could both agree that like you said, I'm going to take one of your quotes, artificial price inflation is destabilizing and natural price deflation is civilizing.
Yes.
And all the biblical books and everything that we've learned over time and really just follows that same weave.
Absolutely. And, it's somewhat obvious if you really, that's why I love getting.
I love that because it is obvious. It is obvious when you open up your ears.
Yeah. And just to try, like, again, the word property is so important, but what do people typically think when you say the word property? They think real estate, usually, right? Oh, real estate. No, we're talking about the relationship between owner and asset. How do we preserve the integrity of that relationship? Right? You cement it via conflict, right? It's like, who owns this land? Whoever won the war owns the land. Now, who owns the land post-war? Well, it's whoever contracts for it. And how do we honor those contracts within the legal system? So this idea of property being the unshakable foundation of civilization is really important. Like, if you don't have recourse to the product of your past freedom, if I've gone out and built a successful business, but I can't secure it, right? Someone can just take it arbitrarily. Then all of a sudden, the smart people, the inventors, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, they're not being rewarded in society. So everyone suffers. All of civilization suffers. Imagine if Steve Jobs didn't have strong property rights.
You're right. He
wouldn't
innovate.
Have nothing. We'd be still in the 1980s or whatever situation we'd be in. So strong property rights are everything. Everything. You have strong property rights, you create wealth, you create freedom, all the above. And fiat currency inflation, again, I've probably said it 5 times, but that's all it is. It's only a violation of property rights. It's nothing else.
If the relationship between asset owner and asset was solidified and globally recognized on something like the Bitcoin blockchain, where if one country decided to have a military takeover, a coup, a conquering, any non-political recourse or any type of recourse, what would be the point of wars? I mean, what would be the point of trying to invade another country if you could not take their resources? Because the distributed ledger is agreed by the rest of the world as this is what we're using now. This is the new human. Bitcoin is our generation. Bitcoin is humanity's social contract. And now we can have one with each other. It's beautiful. Global social contract.
Yes. Global social contract. And to your point, removing the carrot from warfare, right? The carrot from war has always been, it's an economic calculation. Can I go cost effectively defeat these people in combat and then extract tribute from them? If there's a positive, if it's profitable for me to do so, I will do so. I did this podcast recently with Jason Lowery. He's a great guy. You should have him on your show. MIT student.
I would love to.
He's got a very interesting thesis on Bitcoin. But he jokingly calls all these great conquerors the original economist. Genghis Khan is like looking at your territory saying, what do you have? And then he's running the calculus. Can I beat you in warfare? Well, if it's profitable for me to do so, then I'm going to come kick your ass and take your stuff. But with Bitcoin, it's something fundamentally different. It's like you can come and kick whoever's ass you want, but if they've custodied their Bitcoin intelligently, you're not getting shit, right? You can't touch it. So this idea of an untouchable wealth medium is very disincentivizing to warfare, which is just incredible to think about.
Going to bring about world peace. It's such a beautiful thing, and thank you for taking the time today and going over all these subjects. My listeners definitely are going to want to hear more from you, so I'm going to have them check it out, and we'll have in the notes your podcast called What is Money on YouTube and wherever you get your audio. Robert Breedlove. Wow. I mean, with part 2, we got to get into the singularity about how potentially Bitcoin is the future robotics way of taking over humanity by taking all of our own powers away from us slowly. It's crazy stuff. But I don't want to scare the listener. I'll see you later.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Bye.